You don't have to. If you mentioned Crabgrass, it's been reprinted more than 40 times.
Oh, I have.
And
Yes.
it's kind of a classic history of Suburban, even though they're family.
For those of you who have joined on Zoom, welcome. Get comfortable. We'll be starting the program in just a few minutes. One reminder, if you haven't been part of our programs before, the way to ask questions via Zoom is to use the QA feature, which you'll see either at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on your device. And we will read those questions. Gilbert Whitner, who's manning the screen, will capture all of your questions and ask them at the end. The audience in the room is also asked to hold their questions until the end. But if you can just sit tight in the Zoom audience, we're, I think, seating just a couple of people coming in, and we'll be started soon. For those of you joining on Zoom, it's the top of the hour, but we'll just give us a few more minutes. We have a couple of people getting settled in, and Colin is doing a final audio check for us. That will happen at 4 o'clock too. It'll give me an idea of where we are with time. Yeah, only at the end. Yeah. Ruth is going to tell me her name. Give it one more minute. I'm going to say something and introduce you. Good afternoon. We have just a couple of guests getting seated, but we're going to get the program started. Thanks so much for joining us on a beautiful fall afternoon in New England. We really dodged a bullet with that storm. It's my pleasure to first introduce, to welcome you, our Executive Director, Deirdre Anderson.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, everyone. That's a lovely welcome. It's a pleasure to be gathered here with all of you again at the start of our annual lecture series. As Eileen said, my name is Deirdre Anderson. I have the pleasure of serving as the Executive Director of the Hingham Historical Society, and we are thrilled to welcome you all here and the many people we have on Zoom. And we're very excited about this year's series, and we are very grateful for Kenneth Jackson for traveling to see us here today in Hingham. We at the Hingham Historical Society have had an exciting development since we've all been gathered for our lecture series last year, and that is welcoming Max Nosbish as our education manager to our team. Max is the third full-time employee in the Society's 100-plus year history, and he has already made an impressive mark in his short time here. Perhaps you've seen him around town in our cool new yellow history cart giving tours. Perhaps you saw him in the July 4th parade, but I'm going to turn over the mic to Max. He will work closely with the Education Committee in the coming year to plan subsequent year's series. And I am happy to introduce you to Max. He'll tell you a little bit about his background and then turn it back to Eileen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. I know a couple of you, some of you guys are familiar, and other people I have not met. So if I haven't met you, hello, welcome. My name is Max. I'm the new education manager here at the Hingham Historical Society. Thank you all so much for coming out in person on, like we've said, a beautiful day to see this lecture series. I hope it's interesting. And I hope all our future iterations of our lecture series are going to be interesting. That's what I'm going to be working on very hard on the next year and the next couple of years, so we can keep this momentum going. Thank you. I want to just take a moment to thank Eileen. Eileen's been showing me the ropes with the lecture series and helping me out a lot. So round of applause for Eileen. Couldn't do what we do without her. And real quick, I want to say one program note. In 2 weeks, on October 1st, we have our house tour. So raise your hand if you've been to house tour. Oh my gosh. Next year, I'm going to be asking the same question, and I want to see every hand raised because this is a really exciting time for us. I don't think we did it like last year or the past year. So we're bringing it back. People are opening up their homes, their historic homes, for members of the public to walk through and to explore and learn about. So if you have the opportunity on October 1st, please come out and get a ticket for house tour. Check it out. And if you really, really, really want to help us out, we really, really, really would love to have you volunteer. That would be a big help to us. We are staffing our house tour, getting docents, people who are passionate about sharing history, sharing it with others. So if you're interested in that, just talk to one of the staff members here at the Historical Society. We would love if you volunteered. But if not, please at least just buy a ticket and come out. And with that, I think we're ready to get started.
Terrific.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Max. So welcome everyone to the first of 7 programs in Suburbia, the American Dream. We will be looking back at how we got to where we are today, challenges today, a little bit of looking forward. Ken has written a book that's just so absorbing. So let me get into a formal introduction of this esteemed professor. Kenneth T. Jackson is the Jacques Barzin Professor Emeritus of History at Columbia University, where he has also chaired the Department of History. Ken is a graduate of the University of Memphis, and I should mention his wife, Barbara, who he met in Memphis, is with us today. So good to see you, Barbara. You'll hear a little tinge of Memphis in Ken's voice as well. Ken received both his MA and PhD degrees from the University of Chicago. Ken served on the faculty of Columbia University for more than 50 years, from 1968, an interesting year at Columbia, as I recall, until 2020, when he retired from teaching, but continued his work as an historian and frequent expert commentator. Ken has been a featured contributor to more than 69 documentaries. He has collaborated on 2 important public exhibitions. The first, Transformed Houses, was a Smithsonian Institution project that focused on domestic architecture in working class neighborhoods. The second, sponsored by the Municipal Art Society in Manhattan, New York City, dealt with physical devastation in ghetto areas and was exhibited in more than a dozen venues around the United States. Well, Ken's honors are too numerous to mention in full, but one that's important to him, I know, is Columbia University's highest honor, the Alexander Hamilton Medal, awarded to Ken in 2016, a medal that's not often awarded to members of the faculty. Ken is a past or present member of the editorial boards of numerous professional journals and is the general editor of the Columbia History of Urban Life, 20 volumes of which have appeared thus far. Ken also edited a book, The Encyclopedia of New York City, whose second edition was published in 2010 with more than 1,500 pages of entries. It's just fascinating. So important to our topic today, though, is Ken being the author of Crabgrass Frontier, the Suburbanization of the United States. This landmark work, when published in its first edition in 1985 by Oxford University Press, won both the Francis Parkman and the Bancroft Prize, and the New York Times chose it as one of the most notable books of the year. By 2021, it had been reprinted 5 times in hardcover and 39 times in paperback. Last year, The Atlantic magazine named Crabgrass Frontier, quote, one of the 8 defining books of our era that explains why the U.S. has become the nation it is today. It is my great honor to welcome Kenneth Jackson to the Hingham Historical Society to kick off this year's lecture series. Ken, welcome. And Ken's going to put his microphone on. I was supposed to give him a heads up to do that, so
It's on.
on now, okay. Would you like to say hi?
Hi. Southern accent, so.
Yeah. So the format today is a conversation format. There are questions that Ken has seen that I prepared for him based on reading his book. And so we'll just get started. But let me begin with this statement. In your book, you wrote, suburbanization as a process involving the systematic growth of fringe areas at a pace more rapid than the core city, and as a lifestyle involving a daily commute to jobs in the center, occurred first in the United States and Great Britain, where it can be dated from about 1815. In the next half century, New York, Philadelphia, and Boston exhibited the most extensive changes of their residential peripheries yet witnessed in the world, end quote. Well, in the next hour, we will learn about many of the factors that contributed to these changes, although I know we will only scratch the surface of the detailed history that Ken presents in his book. So my first question for you, Ken, you describe the United States as a suburban nation, and you say that its suburbs, while they come in different types, share certain unique to the U.S. characteristics. Tell us more about that.
Well, I wrote this 40 years ago and things are changing a little bit so that Australia and Canada, Ireland even, are becoming a little more like the United States. But still, we can be described as a nation of people who live in single family detached houses. Certainly Hingham is full of those. In yards that are huge by world standards, in homes that they own, and involving a journey to work. We don't realize that most of the people in the world have no idea what a yard is. Does it feed any animals? Does it grow any crops? It's pretty useless. But we have especially a front yard. Is an American, and the English, a little before us, began to rhapsodize about it. But England didn't have the money or the space to really do the suburbs in the right way, and we did. And so it involves a lot of things which Eileen and I will talk about. But clearly, it's a lifestyle that Hingham, this is not exactly the typical suburb. Most suburbs are not 400 years old. And we can talk about Hingham and how that fits. But nevertheless, suburbanization is much older than we think. It didn't start after World War II. And it starts for a whole lot of reasons that we can go into in a minute. But generally, it's true that we're unlike, you go to Germany and places like that, they do it different. They build their cities in a different way.
Thanks, Ken. So your book chronicles the importance to the initial suburban development of a transportation revolution between 1815 and 1875, well before automobiles. So tell us more about this.
Well, the idea of public transportation is something that Julius Caesar could have done. In other words, when we date it from the 1830 more or less in New York City, it involves an omnibus, which is really a stagecoach with big wooden wheels, pulled by horses, rolling down and it's got three things. It's got a schedule, it's got a route, and it's a fare. In other words, it's not a taxi. It doesn't go where you want it to go or where the driver wants to go. It's got a route. Those three things, those managerial revolution, transform cities because you have to know that when you get on how much it's going to cost, and you have to have an idea that if you stand there, it's going to come. Now, sometimes it takes a long time. There's an important book about Boston written by a guy named Sam Bass Warner 50 years ago, no more than that, 60 years ago, it's called Streetcar Suburbs, the Process of Urban Growth in Boston, 1870 to 1900. And what he really does is talk about streetcars and how they differed in the United States from, let's say, England. In this country, the people who built the streetcar could also speculate in residential real estate, which they were not allowed to do mostly in Europe. So that for a nickel fare, which was, and you can go as far as you want. Just think some of you have been in Europe and other places and you buy a fare on an elevated or on a bus or something. They want to know where you're going. And the price is based on that. Generally in a city or even in the T is, I think, still one fare, isn't it?
Yes.
In Boston. So you could drop your real estate prices by going farther out, and it didn't cost you more for the fare. Now the question is, why don't the poor do that? And Sam Bass Warner says, because the poor or the working class are sometimes moving their job locations, and the streetcars would go out like spokes on a wheel, and therefore you need to know where you were going. So it doesn't move laterally very well. It moves only in one direction.
So you've already talked a little bit about streetcars, and there may be more you want to say, but I wanted to interject one thing that in your book, I was fascinated to hear about the inventor and electrical engineer by the name of Frank Julian Sprague. And for those of us who have studied any Hingham history, the name Sprague was interesting to me. So I did some research and discovered that, in fact, he descends from the same immigrant brothers as the Sprague, who we know as a botanical illustrator, and many other fascinating Spragues. It's quite a talented family. But you wrote that by the turn of the century, half the streetcar systems in the United States were equipped by Sprague, and 90% were using his patents. Quite a talented man. So would you like to say more either about Sprague or about the streetcar?
Well, the electrification of the street, because what happens is, I mentioned the first streetcars, which are really omnibuses, it's stagecoaches, but they're really uncomfortable. The streets are bumpy and crummy. And then they put them on railroad ties, which smooths it out and allows a horse to pull, because it reduces the friction, allows the horse to pull a heavier load, and it's more comfortable for the passengers. The problem with the horse car, which is the horse-drawn streetcar, is the horses get sick. There were various times when there were epidemics of horse diseases. Sprague, whom Eileen just mentioned, electrified them. I think in Richmond, Virginia, but what's unusual about the United States is how quickly. For example, Americans didn't invent the automobile. Essentially, that's a German invention, but Americans built it. And Americans didn't invent the railroad. That was a British thing. But we are the ones who built all the railroads in the 19th century. And we didn't invent a lot of things. But London, for example, the most important city in the world, let's say in 1900 or even in 1914, they didn't electrify their trolleys. They were still using horse-drawn streetcars in World War I. They were gone from even small towns in the United States. So we adopted them with the nickel fare, which was cheap. People could move out and land. The other thing is, we can talk about this too with Eileen, is people are astonished when I say this. Houses in the United States, I know Hingham, that's not true, but are cheap. Relatively inexpensive to the world. You know, there are a few places around Boston and New York and San Francisco and LA, but basically anybody in the United States who has a job that's steady, and especially if their wife works, they can have a house and they can buy it because we have the long-term, fully amortized mortgage, another American invention. And I don't want to get ahead of myself. I'll let Eileen.
So by the 1850s, you wrote that with an exploding population and new transit modes that made commuting possible, the stage was set for planning of the suburb as a romantic community in harmony with nature. And related to this point, could you tell us a little bit about Llewellyn Haskell, Alexander Jackson Davis, and the development of Llewellyn Park, New Jersey?
Well, some of you are familiar with New Jersey, and this is a place called South Orange, which is, you know, within eyesight really of Manhattan office towers. And this was a several hundred acre wooded, you know, Eileen has showed me some of the communities here.
Like World's End?
World's End, you know, where the streets are curving.
Oh,
Well,
Liberty
we kind of
Falls.
invented that too, where the curving streets to, and he did that in 1853, big yards. That's where Thomas Edison lived, by the way. Much mansions really in this Llewellyn Park, and with gates. I remember in 1972, I had a new Dodge, a green Dodge Dart. It was really, I was zippy. I had one of my graduate students with me, and we kind of went in a side entrance to Llewellyn Park. And as I was driving down the roads, police car turns around and chases me and wants to know what I'm doing. I says, I'm a professor at Columbia. I'm writing a book on suburbs. I'm just taking a look. He says, well, he didn't care what I was doing. Get out. You know, you don't have somebody to visit, somebody's not vouching for you. But anyway, it's still I'll give you a complicated sentence, but it's what really has been the story of the United States, the sequential reuse of residential housing by progressively lower income groups. So what happened in the United States for centuries, people would move out to a newer neighborhood, poorer people would move in. We're seeing that's changing now, but that's kind of what happened over a period of time in the United States. Llewellyn Park, that never happened to, because it's got, you know, big houses, big open spaces in the middle for community use and things like that. Still a delightful place. Most suburbs are not that carefully planned, but in general, they do have curving streets.
Yeah. So other examples of what you term romantic suburbs were those designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, a name familiar here in Hingham, and his partner, Calvert Vaux. So can you tell us a little bit about their creation after the Civil War of Riverside outside Chicago?
That's a famous Chicago suburb, still a lovely place. And, you know, Olmsted did many things. He wrote a book about travels in the South here. He was director of the United States Sanitary Commission, which is kind of the Red Cross in the Civil War. And then he became famous for Central Park in New York, which is the most important public open space in the world. Because when Central Park was built, it was 843 acres. And the argument was, this is critical, the argument was that the increased value of the real estate around the park makes the park essentially free to the community for that expense. So in Kansas City or Memphis or whatever, Toledo or whatever your town, the city fathers couldn't sit around a table and say, we can't afford to create a park for the people that's free. And they would say, somebody would say, But in New York City, where land's a lot more expensive than it is in wherever you're talking about, they did it, then they said it's free because the land is worth more near it. It's a public amenity. And Olmsted did that. And he also laid out University of California, Berkeley, Stanford, did the Boston Park system and stuff like this. He did a lot. But Riverside, Illinois is still one of his triumphs because he, you could argue that Frederick Law Olmsted is one of the half dozen most important people in United States history. I think that's probably a little bit of a stretch, but not a lot. He was very talented and did a lot.
And we'll hear a little bit more about Olmsted relative to the Boston area in one of the lectures in this series where we focus on Boston's development of suburbs. So stay tuned for that. Well, the expansion of the steam-powered railroad service from 1865 to 1900 was another driver of suburban development. But you also mentioned during that period, there were some other factors that drove the affluent out of cities. Tell us more about this period.
Well, the world is clubbing. This is what I speak in hyperbole and generalizations, you'll understand. But I would say in general, the world is clubbing up now, ethnically and religiously. Whether it's Ukraine or Japan or China or anywhere else, you got to be Chinese. If you're not 99%, Japan is 99.9% Japanese. And that's the way it's going to stay, even though the country is now in decline. So there's Tokyo, the largest city in the world by far, 38 million people if you count the suburbs. And 20 or 30 years ago, we used to thought, well, Japan is going to become a real competitor to the United States, and Tokyo is going to compete with New York and London. Didn't work out that way because they're just too, I think, as an editorial, too ethnically homogenous to be a great city in the 21st century, I think. So it's going to be London and Paris are homogeneous. Eastern Europe is homogeneous. Or Paris and London, are heterogeneous. And I think that's the trend in the world now. But anyway, in the United States, one of the things that makes us different is that we're defined not by our blood, but by a set of beliefs in democracy and freedom. And in the Declaration of Independence and the Statue of Liberty, we're inculcated from the time we're children. And it doesn't mean that we share anything but our Americanness, and we celebrate that. And that's under challenge. The jury is still out on whether that's going to work. I think it will, but the United States is kind of split right now too. Not necessarily along ethnic lines, but sort of. But anyway, the reason that's relevant to what Eileen was saying is that gives people another reason to move out. If you're in France, you don't have to move out of Paris because everybody's French anyway, or British or German or whatever. But in the United States, there was those disgusting Irish people to move away from, or blacks, or whomever, that weren't like you. And so they tended to be concentrated in the middle of the city. And so they were somebody to get away from. And of course, the example in the United States is overwhelmingly African American, but never, and we can talk about what's going on now, but that was a reason to leave. The other thing was the big cities in Europe and Asia tended to be capital cities, reasons why you wanted to be in the big city. In America, our cities tended to be industrial, and they spewed out noxious fumes and all sorts of stuff that were not necessarily attractive. So the leafy suburbs of this community are typical. The air is fresh and green and everything else. So it was a place to get away from. I know Hingham was also industrial at the time, but that is another reason why American cities tended to be different and sort of less attractive than European cities.
Yeah, and again, we're talking 1865, 1900, so I can envision all that. So, but the steam-powered railroad service, how did that create suburbs that were different from the streetcars?
One of the things, we think here Boston's an example. The T is really what we call light rail. It usually 2 cars. It can stop a lot because it doesn't take a lot of power to get it going. And a streetcar suburb is like the fingers on your hand. In other words, it radiates out from the city along the fingers, and the development is not so no big, so vast between the fingers. And you could live along those lines, and a vigorous 30-year-old man could almost jump on the train without it stopping, as it slowed down or something like that. A commuter railroad is a different kettle of fish. That's what you call a heavy rail. That takes a longer time to get going and stop. They're usually a mile or two, or often 3 or 4 miles between stops. And whereas the streetcar suburb was like fingers on a hand, the commuter railroad is like beads on a necklace. And so I think the fanciest town in the United States, it will never show up statistically, but it's a fact. This place called Greenwich, Connecticut. Now, the Greenwich won't show up as the richest place because it's a railroad suburb. And around the train station, there will be more modest homes for the people who work on the estates and all that sort of stuff. The super fancy modern suburbs, Jupiter, Florida, Palos Verdes, California, places like that, they don't have trains. And therefore, everybody who lives in town, all you have to know is what town you live in. They can pretty much tell you what you make and how much your house costs. That's not something you can do in a place like Greenwich. You have to know what you're talking about to do that. But the railroad suburbs were hugely important. In Boston, Philadelphia, the main line, that term, the main line, comes from the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania Railroad suburban communities outside Philadelphia. And they still have streetcars. And I think they did last time I was there in Philadelphia, did they?
Buses, I know.
And Pittsburgh has it, and a few cities do. I think sometimes you can tell whether a city is doing okay in the sense these older part of the city by whether it has a streetcar or not. And if it doesn't, then it's harder. I'm a fan of Los Angeles and stuff, but it's just now getting a good transit system. I think there's a real question as to whether Los Angeles can ever be a really great city unless it gets people on the train. And it is. It's get moving there, but it's a slow boat. And but I think they make a difference. And there's a difference. Of course, like New York has got every kind of transportation. But they urge the affluent and the middle class to begin to move out, to escape the problems of the inner city. And it's not just the Irish, later it's the Jews who wants to live next to a Jewish neighborhood or a Polish neighborhood or a Russian or Italian. I mean, Americans could be prejudiced against everybody. But the good news about the United States, I think, is we elected Barack Obama as president. Imagine that in France or Great Britain or Japan, somebody who's clearly different from the majority of the population. So we can be proud of and not just ashamed of our history. Our history is not an unbroken story of wonderful things. We've overcome a lot of obstacles. But if you look at it in its world context, how has the rest of the world been? It's like Churchill said of democracy. It's the worst form of government ever invented, except for everything else we've tried. And I think that's part of it. We need to judge ourselves. And I think it's quite wonderful that not only in America are we a nation of second chances. If you're in Britain or France or Germany or Japan or China, you take a test. I don't know, depends on whether you're 12 or 13 or 14. That's your life. How you do on that test is your life forever. No changes. Whether you're going to be a lawyer, a doctor, whatever. Here, you can change your mind and become a doctor when you're, later in life. You can do a lot of things. And you can also be a city lover when you're a hippie and you're 20 and you want to meet more romantic partners. And you can, once you have children, you can move to the quieter, more sedate suburbs. So we have lots of options for you. And I think that's a strength. I think we have a lot of strengths to be proud of here.
So we've talked a lot about technology involving transportation, but one interesting thing in your book was the importance of new construction technology introduced in the 19th century that made private homes affordable for the common man. So tell us about this technology.
We often don't think of it, and I always say things that are obnoxious and controversial, but I always tell students, or used to, that if you are so aggravated by what I said, you can go back to your house, if you live in a house, and smash your fist into the wall. And if it's a typical American house, it's wallboard. And it would hurt your hand, but you would still drive through the family. If you tried that in Germany, you'd break your hand, because what they separate bedrooms from in Germany are concrete building blocks, and that's what they do in most of the world. What we do, well, I lived in a brick house. That's where I grew up in Memphis. Lived in LA, as stucco houses. Most of the Northeast wood clapboard houses, they're really all wooden houses. We built 95% of our houses the same way, with wood. That's the guts of it. The bricks, the stucco, that just keeps out the wind and the rain. The house is held up by 2x4s. They're actually 3 1/4 inches by an inch and 1/4 inches. They're exactly 16 inches apart and exactly 8 feet tall. It was invented in Chicago in the 1830s when the city was exploding in population, and they had to build them fast. It's called a balloon frame house. It's mostly American. French have these tile roofs. You couldn't do that in the United States. House would fall down. They're too heavy. You think of the French village and the cute little houses. They're held up by the walls. You kick out the wall, and the house will fall down. You go home and kick out your wall here and change it. Nothing happens. Except it gets wetter or rainy or something like that. The house is held up by popsicle sticks. It looks like popsicle sticks. It doesn't matter where you are in the United States. I mean, if you're building a huge $30 million mansion, maybe you'll do it a different way. But basically, and that is inexpensive. It's an American pattern. It's mostly not been copied around the world. It's inexpensive because we didn't expect to live in a house 150, 200 years. And so who cared how long it was going to live? Turns out those 2x4s, those balloon frame houses have done pretty damn well. You don't let it rain on them or rot. Hey, they do just fine. And when somebody comes to your house to hang pictures or something, it's the person who's the expert. They pound on the wall. They're looking for where the studs are, because they can tell the difference as they hit on the wall. You don't have to do that in another country.
And one of the things that's relevant to Hingham in New England is you said this form of balloon construction replaced the traditional New England frame house that was based on timber frame structures.
Well, it used to be, again, before 1850, if you built a house, well, let's say a log cabin, that's really expensive. What you've got to do is you can't just put logs stopped on each other. You've got to notch them out. And what they had to do before the balloon frame was you needed a person who was a skilled carpenter to build a house, because you had to notch it in different ways at the end of it in order for it to fit. Once you had the balloon frame, it didn't matter. You just nailed the damn thing together. I often say I could do it. I'm sure I couldn't do it. My wife is here to testify to that. But a person with medium skills could do it. A man and his sons could knock together a house pretty quickly. Yeah. And it lasts. I had a student who wrote a book about South Central LA, where middle class people came from Iowa and Illinois and stuff like that to Los Angeles, and they would build their houses in the back while they lived in the front, and they would build houses themselves. They could do it. You could do it in the United States. You can't try that when you're building a serious house or in Europe or something like that.
Yeah, and related to what you said about housing being relatively affordable, cheap here, you wrote, home building was transformed from a specialized craft into an industry.
And let's think about another thing. The United States is big. After all, there are a few places bigger, Canada, Russia, but Canada and Australia is big, the same size, but you can't live in those places. They're 90% uninhabitable. It's frost in Siberia and Canada, mostly cold. They all live along the American border, 50 miles, everybody in Canada. So it's 3,000 miles wide and 30 miles deep. I exaggerate, but that's more or less the story. Whereas the United States, it's mostly livable. And we have a vast country. And around cities, look at Chicago, look at Houston. Houston it's probably the same size, I'm making this up, but not really. Same size as Boston. But Boston's going to be 1/3 or 1/4 the size. They may have both 5 million people in the metro areas. But in Houston, you can just go out. Whereas think of Boston, all these waterways, all these towns like Hingham, which have been there as long as Boston just about, and they've got their own history and don't want to be absorbed. So in the Boston area, it's different because the city was hundreds of years old by the time it grew out to a place like Hingham, and therefore they said, we don't want to be part of Boston. Roxbury, Dorchester, places like that fought that battle in the 19th century. But in Boston, they stopped annexing in 1860s, more or less. And that changed it. So that, some people say for the better. People love Boston just because doesn't have as many people as Houston. But that's what's happened in the United States. The southwestern suburbs tended to be able to go out, or my hometown of Memphis, go out forever and just add it in, whether the people liked it or not. Because they weren't already incorporated as a separate city. They were just a bunch of houses. And so they brought them into the city. It makes a difference. I'm not sure better or worse, but
one thing before we leave the 19th century, and it wasn't a question that we had discussed, but it's in your book, this simplified way of building houses, the fact that it's now an industry, allowed for the creation of kits and Sears homes, and people could get all of the materials that they needed to, I guess, build houses.
Well, in a Sears catalog, you could order, you could look at the model, the pictures of the picture, and then order the plans. Now, I don't mean that means you could build it, but it wasn't such an expensive, it was a skill that could be moved around, and we don't do this much anymore. But, still people do build. Well, think of this. In the United States, I'm sure many of you are homeowners. There's a lot of, when we think about how much value we've added to our home in the last 30 years, Barbara and I had a house that gained $100 a day for 30 years in value. Hadn't gained much in lately. But that's not because of anything you did. That's just because the real estate values went up. But we never considered the work we put into it. We paint the damn houses. We cut the grass. We trim everything, and we do all these repairs. Most people in the world don't do that. That's an American thing, this do-it-yourself, Home Depot and all this kind of stuff. It's a big, big business in the United States. But that helps make houses in America affordable. The work we as homeowners put into them.
Yeah. So getting back to the transportation theme that runs throughout your book in different ways, the early 20th century brings with it the development, of course, of the automobile. So what are some of the characteristics of the automobile suburbs? We've had streetcar suburbs and the steam railroad suburbs, and now we're talking automobile suburbs. How are they different?
By the way, we didn't mention ferry suburbs. There are a few. The first ferry suburb was really Brooklyn. East River is kind of small. Brooklyn was a suburb. Brooklyn's about to be bigger than Chicago. That's a pretty big suburb. But anyway, it's technically part of the city. But steam ferries ferries never apply here, I know in Hingham, but not most cities. Hong Kong, of course, has a famous Star Ferry, and Vancouver has many. But basically, that's a specialized form. But the automobile, which, as I said, really German, Carl Benz, I think was his name. We didn't invent that. Henry Ford did not invent the automobile. There's no suggestion by any historian that he did. What he did was typically American. I'll build them. You can be your idea, but I'll show you how to build a thing. He built a moving assembly line. So, and they're still doing it in Detroit. And the Ford plant is, he brought the cost of a Ford to $290. And he paid his workers $5 a day. So they could begin to buy a Ford. So by 1929, this is kind of roughly your period, half of all the cars in the world were Fords, and 85% of them were American. Kansas had more cars than Germany did. In fact, one of the most amazing things about the United States is that I don't think any other country, maybe Canada, had the same automobile ownership penetration as the United States in 1929, probably until 1970, which means that every person in the United States, including black sharecroppers in Mississippi, could all get in a 5-passenger car and drive somewhere. Now, they obviously didn't all do that, but technically it's possible, theoretically. So that's one thing. Automobile ownership is everybody. Now, so what? What's that got to do with the shape of Boston or New York or LA or any other city? Whether it's a streetcar or an electric or a railroad, steam railroad, they are going in. They're going into the center, wherever that center is. So you want to know why? You can see the Boston skyline from here, because that's where they put tall buildings up. Why? Because that's where you maximize the number of pedestrians and the amount of money you can make with a certain amount of real estate. Mass transit, public transit does that. And you have to. In other words, there were amusement parks on the end of almost all the streetcar lines. For 75 years, Coney Island, the most famous. But ridership, if you got on the darn thing, you were going downtown. It didn't matter where you wanted to go. It's going downtown. And of course, all the department stores were downtown. For years and years, I used to go around the United States speaking on the past and future of fill in the blank, Toledo, Las Cruces, San Francisco, stuff like this. And and by the way, Eileen McIntyre is a treasure. I mean, a treasure. I've done this, I don't know, hundreds of times at least. I've never had someone who was as careful and accurate and organized and in love with history as she was. So I'm not trying to, but all I needed, she gave me a tour too of our town today. All I needed was somebody to take me around for 2 hours. Didn't matter where it was. Muncie, Indiana. That's pretty small, but any city. Kansas City, didn't matter. I wanted to see downtown where I could see the abandoned department stores, which, by 2000 were all gone. I needed to see the latest shopping center where 30 years ago everybody thought was the latest thing, best thing since canned food. I needed to see the ghetto. There was almost always a poor neighborhood. And there were the nice neighborhoods somewhere. And it was true, not New York so much. And they may be some exception. And Hingham is a little bit different than the rural pattern. But in the United States, it was pretty clear. I stumbled once or twice and hundreds of times, but not often. And because I could drop the names of those places too. I knew the shopping mall. I knew where the neighbors were. I knew what the names of the department stores were. Anyway, that was what that. But the automobile not only does not require you to go downtown, it's the opposite. It discourages you to go to the center because, you can get there. And now what are you going to do? When you get to central Boston, what are you going to do with the car? It's not like free parking. There's an important book out now called The High Cost of Free Parking, which is suggesting that, a lot of our environmental problems and problems with fossil fuels and stuff are because we use so much the automobile. We have to in most of the United States because we don't have the mass transit, and the department stores have mostly gone the way of the horse and buggy. But it matters where people live. And that's what Sam Bass-Warner said about why do poor people live in the middle? Why do the poor people live closest to the centers of the city, which is where the money is concentrated, and not out. Well, if you go far enough, you can really drop the price of land. But most people don't want to go that far. But the automobile has hugely impacted the shape of American cities, even a place like Boston and its suburbs that dates back so many years and so many waterways and everything else. Still, the automobile is king. Maybe, if we talk about the future, who knows? Maybe it'll be different. But in our lifetime, it's the car. And the truck. The truck is about as important as the car, by the way.
It's not really, with the automobile, it's not only affecting where people live and work, but or shop, but also where industry locates. They don't have to be in the center anymore.
Well, they used to be, even we mentioned New Jersey, in a place like Patterson, New Jersey. You built freight engines, steam engines, on multi-story buildings. Can you imagine anything crazier than that? But that's what they did. Manufacturing was in multi-story buildings. And then what happens is you begin to get electrification, the electrification of truck lorries too. You didn't want multi-story, you wanted big spaces where you could get in big trucks, and these trucks and these little, looks like golf carts, but that's not what they are. They run in and push their feet underneath and lift up and move around. And that also hurts industry in the inner city. And boy, has the Northeast felt that. There are all these industrial cities where it was appropriate to build things, and now they've shifted to a service economy, which is a whole different kettle of fish. But it matters. It matters what you build. Just think, in China, 800 million people, that's a ballpark number, have moved from the farm to the city in the last 20 years. It's an unbelievable number of people. Do they live in houses? No. They live in 40-story apartment buildings, all look alike. And by the way, a lot of them are empty now and they can't pay for them, but that's another real estate story. But in other words, the way we build, the Soviet Union, same thing. If you go to Japan, which is a tiny country with a lot of people, you'd think they'd all live in tall buildings. Nope. They live on the ground, probably because they're worried about earthquakes. There are a few. I'm not saying there are no tall buildings in Tokyo, but there are a few. There are only two. In Russia, you would think all they've got is space. And do they build single-family houses? They build buildings. So, they built relatively big buildings on the edges of cities. But it's just crazy. The United States chose small, but here in Hingham, you're beginning to see a huge difference in the age of the automobile. In the 1950s, after World War II, and all those millions of servicemen are coming home. Boy, do they want to get home. Starting babies, having families, moving into houses. They want houses with yards and places for their little girls to play in the backyard. And it's important, and that's what happens. Now, high divorce rates, people living longer, kids want to be in the middle of the city or somewhere else. Now all of a sudden we're seeing here in the Hingham shipyard, we were just there. Look at not many single family houses in there. They're all condos and stuff like that. So whereas it used to be 95% of the residential structures were single family houses surrounded by grass. The world thinks that's crazy. But now, less than half of all residential construction in the United States is single-family houses.
So one thing just to add, and I want to ask you to talk about this because we have to move on to the next question, but one of the things you said changed with the automobile is that the parlor and the porch and the formal lifestyle that they supported were among the first things to go. And also that people got more isolated. They'd drive into their garage and then go through the carport into their house, and they wouldn't be out visiting with the neighbors as they strolled along from a streetcar or a train station or something. And even driving around Hingham, you see the 19th century neighborhood still reflecting that openness to the street. And then later,
usually a smaller yard and off on our front porch. One of the things we've really lost a lot, I think, with the front porch is there's a thing called the new urbanism in the United States. It's been around for 30 years. And they want to build houses within 8 feet of the sidewalk. They want a front porch. They want you to walk around and see your neighbors because we've lost that. You're really right. And we could talk about the current state of the United States, but there's something that's not working. The suicide rate has exploded. The alcoholism and drug addiction deaths have exploded. It used to be, when I wrote this book, the way to die in the United States, if you were like us, was in a car. That was by far the most dangerous thing to live. Now, suicides, drug overdoses, especially for young people, are much higher than ever. And they're also much more deadly than cars. Now, seat belts have something to do with it, but still, it's a big difference. So I love the United States. I think, we've got the best of everything, but we had a Chinese guide once came to live with us for a year. We spent some time traveling around China. And I'll never forget, he was painting an indoor office, and he called us Eagle. We called him Eagle. He said Americans were too stupid to remember their real names. But he said, what's the difference between China and the United States? He says, in the United States, you're free but not safe. In China, you're safe but not free. You know, that sums it up pretty much, you know. I'm sure in Japan, there's no such thing no such thing. Homicide doesn't exist. Guns don't exist. Houston has way more. New Orleans will have more homicides than all of Japan. But, you know, it's a different way of life.
So getting back to the 19th century.
Okay. Eileen's got a tough job here.
That's all right. And it's fun talking to you. But I had no idea about this. So you talked about the influence of Edward Bach, who served for 30 years as the editor of the Ladies' Home Journal. So what makes him important to suburban development?
Well, you know, a lot of how we live is culturally determined. It's not just cheap land and cheap transportation and stuff like this. The notion that a single family house surrounded by trees is the best place to have a family. Andrew Haswell Green has a little bit to do with that. Some architects in the 19th century pushed this idea, and the idea that a woman should work at home, not so much in the office. I mean, some of these ideas have been sit on their head today, but articles like that and attitudes like that were very important. And even World War II, you know, we thought that everything would change, and it has changed, but it's taken a while. And I know there were a lot of women working at the Hingham Naval Shipyard, but you know, they usually got a letter. I think this one closed pretty soon too. They got a letter saying your services no longer needed. We need men to go back to work because they thought there might be a recession after the war. And by the way, we didn't invent the interstate highway. Hitler more or less did. The German autobahns, because there's a country that needed to move troops or soldiers on one side, has no boundaries on either side, powerful neighbors on both sides. The United States, it's more commercially oriented. Railroads go out from cities like Atlanta and places like that, like on spokes on a wheel. And so all these things kind of culturally determined, but we have to decide. I think now we're a little bit going in another direction, that the lawn is not the be all and end all of life. And there are other ways to live, and we spend a lot of money on fertilizer and landscape architects and stuff like this. But it takes a long time. Nothing changes overnight. But the United States clearly loves green grass, trees, you know.
And so Buck wasn't just publishing pictures of this bucolic area and suggesting that women would be so happy in the kitchen, but they were actually publishing plans for a series of houses that cost at the time between $1,500 and $5,000. And you could order plans, you'd get full building specifications and estimates from 4 builders in different parts of the US for $5 a set. So, you know, I think for a while he was in trouble with some of the architects who felt like they were losing business, but they found a way to get along. But
well, you know, we never have, even though houses are relatively inexpensive in the United States, we never have really mass-produced houses. Some of the suburban, you know, the Levittowns and stuff like that. I'm not saying they didn't do it, but housing is still a labor-intensive job. Repairing it, keeping it, building it, and stuff like that.
so many here today, I think, will most identify with suburban development in the US between the 1940s and 1950s. And we have a lot of neighborhoods, subdivisions that were built here during that time. But you wrote that the prevailing myth is that the post-war suburbs blossomed because of the preference of consumers who made free choices in an open environment. You then point out that most post-war families were not free to choose among several residential alternatives because of federal policies that favored the suburbs. Only one possibility was economically feasible. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think I'm slightly overstated it, but not by much. One of the things we didn't mention too much are schools. In France, there's one school system. In Australia, there's 6. In Japan, there's 64. In the United States, there are like 15 or 30,000, something like that. So that if you move from one place to another in France, or mostly in Great Britain or in Japan, it doesn't really affect the children, education of your children. Here, the independence, I think I saw Hingham High School and stuff like this. In fact, has a lot to do with your kids. That's yet another reason to separate. So we've done all these sorts of things, but I think what Eileen is getting at, there's this topic that's big in the United States today, redlining, homeowners law incorporation, Federal Housing Administration. What we really did, and I think African Americans have, an argument in their behalf. You could, if I could change history, and you can't. So one of the things you got to love in history, you're not going to change it just because you want to change it. But you wish after World War II, let me just use Levittown, which was a enormous, there were several Levittowns, but 18,000 houses, so way bigger than Hingham. And I'd say that's families, and 65,000 people or something like that. And they built it kind of mass produced. And it was a good deal. Less than $100 a month. Taxes, mortgage, interest, everything. Which is cheaper than it would cost you to rent an apartment in Brooklyn, or as cheap. And you got a new Bendix washer, you got a carport, and you got a backyard where your little girls could play. And you could watch them. And there were all these wonderful swimming pools all over the place and tennis courts. There were lines to get in line to buy a Levitt house. Of course, there was a shortage of houses because during World War II, and just before there was the Depression, in World War II, we were building tanks and airplanes and guns, and not so many houses. I know in Hingham you built houses outside the shipyard, but to house war workers, but basically you didn't build very much. So now you have this huge demand for homes and new families. And there's a baby boom. We're still talking about the baby boomers right now, born after all these soldiers come back. Wouldn't it have been nice in history if it had been open to everybody, and you in line, and you come up and want to fill out a form, and I say, this is an open community and everybody can live here. And you say, it doesn't mean Negroes does it. Yeah, it does. They want to live here. And you can say, we're not doing that. So it's okay. Go home. Get out of line. There's 50 people behind you, and some of them will say, okay, I'll do that. But we did not do that. The federal government in so many ways was complicit in the racism, individual racism. And I lived in a racist city, for sure, Memphis. Grew up with white only in the front of the bus and stuff like this. But I also lived in military housing. If you're in the military, you're a lieutenant, you want to live in military housing. It's subsidized. And it doesn't make any difference if the guy next door is black. It's a better deal than it is. And you're not going to be overrun with blacks because they only make up, 10% of the military. So nobody in the military rejects housing on the base because there may be a person of another race next door. It's a good, but we did in the United States. And we did it systematically. And one of the reasons Crabgrass Frontier did as well as it did was because I found, I wasn't the person who I didn't invent this, I didn't do anything, but I found something called residential security maps in the National Archives. Nobody had looked there before because who cared about the Homeowners Loan Corporation? I didn't care about it either. I didn't even know about it. But I am a map lover, and I've started pulling down these maps. And I opened the maps, and there were all these pictures of neighborhoods, every city in the United States. And they were red, yellow, blue, and green. Well, I already knew such a thing as redlining. So, so I was able to connect the dots. And they don't let you go into them. Now you have to ask for what you're looking for. But at the time I was a professor and whatever, I wandered around. But I saw if there was a black person anywhere near there, automatic redlined. And Jews, not really, but they could be a B if you were affluent. And the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, which was a very fancy neighborhood then, it was a B, but Jews it couldn't be great. And they were prejudiced against everybody, and they're very detailed. They had every neighborhood in the United States, they had detailed. How much do the houses cost? What's the ethnicity of people living there? Where do they work? All this kind of stuff. I mean, they knew what they were doing, but they happened to be prejudiced while they were doing it. So that's a thing that we built in, racist, built it into our system. So when I say it's not an option, I could have said, well, I really want to live in Brooklyn Heights or Back Bay or somewhere in Boston. But if you wanted to buy a house, and so many people did, you got a little family, it was usually more expensive in the inner city and smaller space. But if you built the house in the suburbs where you could get an FHA loan, 30-year mortgage, low interest rate, what's not to like? And what's some jerk professor saying it's not a good deal in Levittown? People paid $7,000, $8,000 for the house, sold it 30 years later for $300,000, and say it wasn't a good deal. It was a good deal, but it just was not a good deal for blacks. They got kind of maxed out. It was the same in St. Louis. Everything was the same. And now we've tried to fix it a little bit, but it was part of America.
Yeah, so you make the point just from an economic standpoint that the social costs of low density living have been paid by the general taxpayer rather than just by suburban residents because of all the benefits that these policies
that's true.
accrue.
I mean, it's like Donald Trump pays fewer taxes than I do, but I mean, there are all sorts of deals in taxes, and homeowners get some of them. They're not, and deduct your real estate taxes, your mortgage interest. A lot of things like that were major factors. And FHA mortgages were, for a while, it was very difficult for black families to get them. But Americans could get them in general, and that fed this huge suburban boom in the United States after World War II. It's gigantic. It's slowing down. We build fewer new residential units now than we did every year in the 1950s. The country was half as big. So right now, one reason the houses prices are going up, we're not building enough new construction.
So Ken, before we get to some final comments you may want to make, would you say that this idea of the suburban ideal is uniquely American, or is that shared by other countries?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that, though I have traveled in so many other countries. But I do think in Spain, just to take a random example, I live in Spain because, first of all, it's clean. Second of all, couples promenade. I mean, they promenade at night. They go walking, not watch jumping on the stream. At least this is when I was there, slaves there. The women seem to be happy they're women. They dress up and they walk along too. I mean, something like that. But it's all homogenous, more or less homogenous. In other words, that's the way Europe more or less is. And the United States, we have costs in the United States. We pollute. Until recently, we polluted more than any country in the world. Not per capita. I mean, well, per capita for sure, but any place, even China, which has 4 times as many people or 5 times as many people. And we've built this world, and you can't undo it. In other words, we can't suddenly say, whoops, we need to save energy. We need not to pollute the world for our grandchildren. Well, history is important. We built it. We're going to have to live with it. You know what I mean? You couldn't change, not that you would want to, you couldn't change Hingham or the United States overnight. Maybe in generations you could. There'll probably be a slow shift toward, that's what all the planners are pushing now, a little more density, build houses in the backyard, allow in-laws to live in your house, that sort of stuff. Emphasize walking, bicycling, any kind of thing like that that doesn't use fossil fuel. But when I say you didn't have a choice, because it was easy to move to a suburban location with a new house and a Bendix washer and a federally guaranteed mortgage, You did have a choice, but it wasn't a very good choice. You know what I mean? You did the smart thing. I would have done the same thing probably. And it worked for millions, tens of millions of families. Many of our families all had the same benefit. But now we're trying to decide as a country and as a people, should we do that? They're trying to get rid of gas. Now they've so-called mandated you can't have gasoline-powered cars. I don't know after what year they've decided on now. But, we'll see if we can change all that. It's not easy to change culture. It's not easy to change a country. It's just not.
So would you disagree with what you wrote in the book, which was published, 40 years ago? You said then, for better or worse, the American suburb is a remarkable and probably lasting achievement. Do you question that?
Well, I think because lasting, we built the houses and they're still there, and we're not going to unbuild them. You can't. The shopping malls are being abandoned. Everywhere in the United States. They're a bad investment at the moment. I mean, with exceptions. I don't really know. Which way we're going. I did make that guess. I thought the suburban era would be over. Blacks are now much more able to move where they want to move. But we still have a probably bigger underclass in the United States than we did 40 years ago. Now, I don't really know. We can talk about that. Where are we going?
Okay. Any closing comments on this subject overall in terms of how you think about suburbs today?
Still, the way we live is unusual in the world. It involves grass. It involves single-family houses. It involves separate local governments, not like in France is one school district. In Japan, there's 64. But if they say, I'm not making this up, we're on page 164 and 66 today. That's what they mean. Every school child in the 5th grade in Japan is reading those sentences. And in Australia, they have 6 school systems, but it would be as if there's one school system for New England and New York. That's a school system. And that's the way it is. That's not the way we decided to do things. And you're not going to change it. You try to change that, you won't have a long political career. Because we've learned this thing. And here in Hingham, I know Eileen was telling me about a fight about a sign somebody was putting up, right?
Well, there's discussion about
a blinking sign.
Blinking sign.
And there's going to be a town meeting about a blinking sign. That's fairly small scale stuff. But here in Hingham, you can have a meeting about that and people vote on it. And people want that. They want to have something to say and somebody to listen to. Who's to knock that idea? It's hard. It really is. And when we think about the United States, we think of this giant country. It's really the strongest country in the world, with our nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and, the powerful United States Navy and Air Force. But that's what we see, and we see Washington and the American flag, but we are a very decentralized country. Hingham makes a difference. It's a place. It's got a government. They're policemen of Hingham, I guess, right? They're the Hingham Police Department. Most people think, is this crazy? I was speaking in Australia once, and I was in the town of, I can't remember. That doesn't matter what the name of the town was. A suburb of Melbourne, and they had a street, Canterbury Street, and they had a whorehouse in this suburban neighborhood because the government of Victoria, which is the big thing, is more powerful than the state. And they said, if we're going to have brothels in Australia, it looks like there's a demand on us. It's not fair for some suburbs to not have them and other suburbs have them. So we're going to tell on this town, and it was called Canterbury Tales was the name of the town. But I'll never forget that. And it was not the choice of the town, but the choice of the Victorian government. Said, look, if you all don't want brothels, then vote them all out. But of every place. You can't choose your little local town. And you could argue about that one, but I'll never forget that example.
So it looks like we have time for questions from the audience, and I know the Zoom audience has been entering questions as well. Deirdre, do you have the microphone? Could you handle the room? That's great. And Ruth is going to voice the questions for Zoom. So anyone want to start in the room?
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I was wondering whether you've had any thoughts over the last 3 years or so about the effect the pandemic might have had on some of these issues and our suburban environment.
Well, clearly the jury is still out. And that is a subject on most people's minds. And but it's hard to isolate COVID from all the rest of the things that are going on in the world right now. My personal opinion, which is based on a lot of things in history, is that things don't change quickly. The act of going to work, work is not supposed to be fun. And I don't think people work more efficiently at home. I know I don't. The sofa looks pretty good at 2:00 in the afternoon. Take a quick nap and talk to somebody. It's just different. And the biggest corporations, Musk and others, head of Chase Manhattan Bank, JP Morgan Chase, sitting back and saying, if you want to work here, you got to come to work. Actual work. Now, it won't change very quickly, but that's the trend. It's slowly going back to work. That's what I think will happen. What I do not know, and there's billions of dollars, but I can tell you, New York is considered a problem area. A lot of huge companies there. But I can also tell you they're building skyscrapers right now. Right now. So somebody who's got a lot of money is betting that it's going to pay off. Now they prefer resident. One of the big changes in cities in the last 50 years is in the 1970s, let's just say, cities were a place to get out of town. White flight was big everywhere. And you worked in cities and you lived in suburbs if you could. That would be the kind of general model. Now, at least let's say before COVID, it's shifting the other way. The place to live, and I'm going to just talk about New York because I know it well. The price of residential real estate in the city is high. And the office buildings are hurting. And they would like to, if they could, they would retrofit some of those office buildings into apartments. But it's easier said than done. If you have a modern apartment building, the size of the windows, where are the bathrooms, it's not easily done. So if they could do it just like that, they would do it. They can't. So who knows what COVID will do. But my sense of it is epidemic disease has always been dangerous to cities. Yellow fever, which almost destroyed my hometown of Memphis. Philadelphia in the 1790s petitioned the state legislature and said, help us. If this pestilence comes back every summer, it'll drive human life from the town, meaning Philadelphia. Cholera in the 19th century was the epidemic disease. They managed to solve it. So now, the great hospitals, Mass General and Brigham Young?
Yeah, Brigham and Women.
Brigham's Hospital. The great medical institutions tend to be in cities. I think one of the problems of my hometown was it was for the South, a great medical center in Memphis. Elvis was pronounced dead at Baptist Hospital in Memphis, center of Memphis. Well, Memphis is very much dictated by race, and they've built all these new hospitals out on the edge of town. Smaller, not this huge medical center. So it's convenient to the doctors, convenient to the suburban patients, but I don't think it's conducive to medical research. So that Memphis has slipped behind Birmingham. And think of Houston, Houston has a fabulous medical center, gigantic, the Texas Medical Center. If you're dying of pancreatic cancer, do you really care about the neighborhood? Wherever the doctors are that deal with this every day of their life, that's who I want to see. And I think that will. Memphis did not do that, and Birmingham, Atlanta did. And I think betting on on suburban hospitals is not a good way to go when there's concentration. Now they're buying up everything, I'm sure. Harvard's bought up everything in sight. But Yale is scattered all over Connecticut. All the hospitals are now part of the Yale New Haven Medical Center. And same way in Columbia Presbyterian and New York Hospital. It's all, anyway, it's happening. But I don't know. I really don't know. But I do predict that the cities will do fine. After all, we're social animals. People now are to say they're all moving to Florida. Well, have they seen Florida? But, which is actually an ugly state. It's got nice, if you like beaches, it's good to be, but it's just as fair as a place to look at it. It doesn't can't hold a candle to World's End and stuff like that, But young people aren't asking themselves where the taxes are low. They want to know, they want to have opportunity, but they also want to know, where can I meet romantic partners? And you think San Francisco or Chicago or Atlanta or Manhattan or Philadelphia or Boston. They're not, I doubt, I'm sure they're cute people in Hingham too, but it's harder to meet somebody when you're driving a car. It really is. And a sidewalk restaurant will do a much better job of it.
Ken, we're going to go to a question from Zoom. Ruth?
We do. It's a three-parter, okay? Is there such a thing as a sustainable suburb, defined as a place where one can live a low-carbon life with modern amenities? Are there examples in the United States or around the world? And are there models around the world of communities outside of urban hubs that are getting close to sustainability?
Anyway, I'd answer those questions, yes. It's hard because you need more density. You need more density. In California, they're fighting the battle right now because people are leaving California, and one is taxes, but one is the price of housing is kind of crazy. Well, that doesn't make sense. If people are leaving, how is it that house prices are so high? Well, they're trying to drop the price by increasing construction in backyards or mother-in-law apartments in your own house and stuff like that. And walkability, there's this thing called the new urbanism that, again, tries to build new communities. On the other hand, they're fake new communities. If you want an ice cream cone, yeah, you can walk to the corner and get an ice cream cone. You want to buy a mattress? I don't think so. You know what I mean? You got to get in your car to do that. So it's harder to reboot the United States from Walmart and places like that to walking, because you can't really walk to Walmart a lot. They have parking lots are too big for that. And I think about, I wanted to write the new book on the suburbs. I want to call it The Road to Hell, but anyway, there's a giant, there are these mega churches in the rest of the world. I don't think there's one in Hingham. At least I didn't see it. But, tens of thousands of members. And we have one in Memphis called Bellevue Baptist Church, which used to be in the center of the city. Now it's on the edge around the interstate highways and interchanges and stuff like this. Gigantic church. Looks like a shopping center. It's a big community and it's surrounded by parking lots. And a big seminary across the street. It's all, I don't know what the Bellevue land or something like this. But you cannot walk to that church. It's big highways and everything. You've got to drive to the church. That's the work that we've built in so much of or schools that have huge play areas and ball fields, but there's nowhere to walk. So fewer and fewer American children are walking to school or riding their bikes to school because it's too dangerous. And I think that's what we've got to do is it's not going to happen in my lifetime, but we do have young people who are really interested in that. And it takes a generation or two. But I do think that we'll see more people interested in, fewer people putting so much fertilizer on their front yard, and I'm guilty, which is not environmentally correct, and letting the front yard grow to whatever the front yard wants to be. But it's a slow change. But I think there are examples, and we will see more in the next 25 years. Will they change the United States a lot? Probably not. But electric cars might. Who knows? It'll take a lot. It's more than one thing. Just like suburbanization is not one cause. We don't like blacks, or we don't like small apartments, or we like grass, or we cheap construction, or redlining or income tax write-offs. It's not one thing. It's a whole culture that we have built in the United States that has favored over a couple of centuries suburbs. It's amazing that cities exist. If in fact, listen, I've been to Hiroshima and places like that. If you went to Japan or Tokyo, and then you went to Detroit, or by the way, not just Japan, how about Germany? You'd say, who won World War II anyway? Because Hiroshima's thriving. I mean, maybe Manhattan can compete with it with department stores. Maybe, I say. And this is not a huge city in American terms, but they still do it. And people walk. Germany used to have, you could not open on Sunday. That helped mom and pop stores and hurt Walmart. Because if you're mom and pop, we can have some time off to see the grandchildren or something else. Well, they helped you in Germany by saying, it doesn't matter whether you want to be open or not. You may not open this drugstore on Sunday. You got to be closed by 2:00 on Saturday afternoon. Helps that helps smaller places. The other, we don't. And we'll see what happens.
So Ken, we're going to get another question in the room.
Yes, thank you. You were mentioning, I hadn't thought much about this, the kind of the disappearance or the decline anyway of suburban shopping centers, which of course we've all experienced around here. And I'm just wondering if you could comment a little bit on the rise of national global deliveries and how that's changing the suburb too, Amazon versus the shopping center.
That's true. That's a tougher one, Roy, because it's awfully convenient. And that's the influence of the pandemic. People didn't want to go to the grocery store. Even now, this gets pretty convenient to have groceries delivered, or shoes, or anything else. And so it's so easy. And I try to, in my own little way, not shop online. But at my age, you don't. The other thing is, I remember talking to the head of CBS, who owned. What else did he own, Barb? He owned lots of things. Tish. His name was Tish. But he didn't, I was 50 then. He didn't care about because by the time you're 50, you've already decided what shoes to buy and what car to drive and stuff like that. And that's the way the advertisers are. They don't care about people that are over 60 because we've already made up because I said, but I have much more money now than I had when I was 25. But you don't spend it in the same way. And I think that's one way. And shopping centers have paid the price. Suddenly, you want to just buy something and get in and get out. You can't get in and get out of a 400-story shopping mall. And more people have decided that. So the strip mall is kind of coming back a little bit. But malls are failing all over the United States and being retrofitted. By the way, it's sometimes fitness centers and dentist offices and stuff like that. Something else to do with.
Ruth, you have another question on Zoom? Okay. Anything else in the room? Here we go.
I have a question
Wait,
regarding.
microphone.
Oh, thank you. I have a question regarding larger cities. Now, I lived in Bombay for 10 years. It's pretty crowded.
Sure.
India is pretty crowded, 1.2 billion people.
And about to be bigger than China. Maybe it already is.
Well, I think it's getting there very rapidly. China has a lot more space. India is equal to the U.S. east of the Mississippi. When you have an urban city, in your evaluation of American urban centers, and you've talked about European and Chinese, what would, in your mind's eye, what do you think will happen to cities where you have this intense population? And will they ever become truly modern in terms of the infrastructure? I don't know, maybe it's a whole suburb. The English tried new cities around Cambridge and London.
But they only had 30,000 people, so.
That's
You're
correct.
right.
What do you think a solution like an urban center in India could be given your planning experience?
Well, first of all, India has a middle class bigger than the United States. So they have the people with money in India, And a lot of them are doctors and lawyers and flooding American universities, for one thing. So India is okay, but the problem is there are 800 million poor people around too. And that's going to be a tougher nut to crack. And they have this caste system that's still lingering. It's because you're right. The country's not big enough for 1.5 billion people, really. And I confess that India is probably the only place I haven't been. And I resisted. The government was trying to pay my way, I don't know, 20 years ago. And Barbara and I resisted because I thought I just would be depressed if I always had these beggars all around and everywhere I wanted to go. And I'm sorry I didn't do it then, and I'd sort of like to do it now. But I don't really know India very well, except that they're at the top of India. They're doing extraordinarily well. The people who are untouchables and those people, they got a tough road. But China is unbelievable. We were there 40 years ago almost. Going to China was like going, not to the third world, it was like going to the 19th century. They didn't have headlights, they didn't have signs, they didn't have anything. And what they do in 30 years, I mean, they built these enormous, now they look like they made some mistakes. So China didn't do a perfect job. How can you move that many people from a rural subsistence life? So they have, maybe India can profit from China's example, because China did do a lot and did lift themselves up. So they're in a different economic place than India is right now. Maybe not. I think we did say a little too quickly that China was going to surpass the United States in a few years. Most people say, I don't think so. China's going to be doing well if they can continue to do as well as they have been doing. But nevertheless, I think the Chinese example partly gives India hope, but China has a more centralized, powerful government, for better or worse, than India does.
It also has more resources.
And probably more resources.
Because India's tentacles have to go far beyond India.
So all the problems of the world aren't going to be solved anytime soon.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And I think we're fortunate in the United States. Just think, not only are we big, but we've got natural resources. We got forests, we got oceans, God bless America. I mean, it's an amazing place. And we just don't want to screw it up.
Well, on that optimistic note, Ken, on behalf of the Hingham Historical Society and all of us here and on Zoom, a big thank you to Kenneth Jackson. What an enlightening afternoon. Such a great way to begin our lecture series, Suburbia, the American Dream. And thanks to both Ken and Barbara for coming to Hingham on what was a very stormy day yesterday, leaving your lovely home in Chappaqua, New York. It was my pleasure to show you a bit of our town this morning, and I hope you find a reason to visit again. A couple of quick announcements for our audience. First, our next lecture in this series on November 12th features Francesca Amon of the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Amon will discuss the critical role played in rapid development of suburban subdivisions after World War II by the bulldozer. Another fascinating book, things that I hadn't given a lot of thought to. It should be quite interesting for everyone. Second, for those of you at the museum today, please join us for conversation and light refreshments on the second floor, where you also can purchase a copy of Crabgrass Frontier, which Ken will be happy to autograph. And thanks to all of you on Zoom today for your attention and questions. Before we end the Zoom, my thanks as always to Colin McGinnis behind the screen over there for his technical assistance. And thanks today as well to Ruth Gilbert Whitner of the Education Committee for managing the questions from the Zoom audience. This concludes our Zoom. Look forward to seeing you on the second floor.